Picture this moment. The largest conflict humanity has ever witnessed. A war so massive it touched every single corner of our planet. Millions of lives lost. Entire nations destroyed. And when the dust finally settled, the world we live in today was born from those ashes. But here's what keeps historians awake at night. Here's the question that echoes through decades. With all their early victories, with all their military might, with all their calculated strategies, how did the Axis powers manage to lose everything? How did Germany, Japan, and Italy go from dominating half the globe to complete and utter defeat? The answer isn't what you think. It's not about one battle. It's not about one mistake. It's about a series of catastrophic decisions that sealed their fate before they even realized it. And today, I'm going to take you through every single moment that led to their downfall. But before we dive deep into this incredible story, do me a favor. If you love history that's told differently, that makes you think, that reveals the truth behind the greatest events of our time, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't just another history lesson. This is the untold story of how superpowers crumbled, how empires fell, and how the world changed forever. And trust me, you don't want to miss a single detail of what's coming next. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and let me take you on this journey. Because by the end of this video, you'll understand World War II in a way you never have before. Now, let's rewind the clock. Let's go back to a time before the war, before the chaos, before everything fell apart. We're talking about the 1920s. The world looked completely different back then. There were 6 major powers running the show, 6 nations that held the strings of global politics, economics, and military strength. But among these 6, 2 stood head and shoulders above the rest. 2 genuine superpowers that controlled more wealth, more territory, more influence than anyone else. And here's the interesting part. Both of these titans would eventually fight on the same side. Both would join the Allies. First, you had Britain. The British Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen. Think about that for a second. The sun literally never set on British territory. They had colonies, dominions, and territories scattered across every continent. Their navy was unmatched. Nobody could challenge British control of the oceans. If you wanted to move goods, if you wanted to project power, if you wanted to dominate trade routes, you had to deal with Britain. They were the gatekeepers of global commerce. Then you had the United States. America wasn't just rich. America was obscenely wealthy. The financial heart of the entire world beat in American cities. Wall Street wasn't just a street. It was the center of global finance. American industry was booming. American innovation was exploding. The United States had everything: resources, technology, manpower, and most importantly, distance from potential conflicts. Protected by 2 massive oceans, America seemed untouchable. These 2 powers, Britain and America, should have kept the world stable. They should have maintained order. But then something happened that nobody saw coming. Something that changed everything. The year was 1929, and the global economy didn't just stumble. It crashed. Hard. The Great Depression hit like a tsunami, and suddenly, these 2 superpowers weren't interested in policing the world anymore. Britain pulled back. America withdrew. They looked inward, trying to save their own economies, trying to help their own people. And in that vacuum, in that moment of weakness, something dark began to grow. All over the world, chaos breeds opportunity. When people are desperate, when economies collapse, when hope disappears, they look for answers. And sometimes, they find the wrong ones. In that chaos, nationalist movements exploded. Governments that promised strength, that promised glory, that promised to restore national pride rose to power. And the 2 most dangerous examples emerged in Germany and Japan. These weren't just new governments. These were regimes with vision. Dark visions, but visions nonetheless. They looked at Britain and America and saw empires built on resources extracted from colonies around the world. And they wanted the same thing. Germany wanted living space. They wanted resources. They wanted to build an empire that would make them a global superpower. Japan had similar ambitions. They looked at their island nation and saw limitations. They needed oil. They needed rubber. They needed iron. They needed territory. and they were willing to do absolutely anything to get it. But here's what made these regimes truly dangerous. Here's what separated them from every other ambitious nation in history. They weren't just willing to negotiate. They weren't just willing to make deals. They were prepared for war. In fact, they embraced war. They saw military conflict not as a last resort, but as a tool, as a legitimate means to achieve their goals. And that mindset, that fundamental belief that war was acceptable, was the spark that would ignite the entire world. Britain chose a different path, but it was equally problematic. They adopted something called appeasement. Now today, that word makes historians cringe. Today, appeasement is treated like a curse word, a cautionary tale of what happens when you try to negotiate with tyrants. But back then, in the 1930s, appeasement was popular. People loved it. Why? Because nobody wanted another war. The First World War had ended barely 20 years earlier. An entire generation had been slaughtered in the trenches, millions dead for a few miles of mud. Nobody wanted to repeat that nightmare. So when British Prime Minister Chamberlain tried to negotiate with Hitler, people cheered. They thought he was being wise. They thought he was being prudent. There's this incredible artifact that survived from that era, a document that perfectly captures the delusion of appeasement. It's called the Anglo-German Declaration, and both Chamberlain and Hitler signed it. This happened right after the Munich Conference, where Britain and France basically gave Hitler permission to take over German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia. They carved up another country to satisfy Hitler's demands, and in return, Hitler signed a piece of paper. Chamberlain held up that document and declared it guaranteed peace for our time. Peace for our time. Those words would haunt him. Because less than 12 months later, Chamberlain would be standing before Parliament declaring war on Germany. That piece of paper meant nothing. Those promises were worthless. Hitler had played them perfectly, but while Europe was sleepwalking toward disaster, the war had already begun on the other side of the world. 1931. That's when everything started. That's when Japan made its move. They invaded Manchuria, a region in northern China. And from there it escalated. What started as a territorial grab turned into a full-scale war against China. Japanese forces swept through Chinese territory, capturing cities, destroying resistance, pushing deeper and deeper into the country. Their advance seemed unstoppable at first. But China is enormous. The territory was vast beyond imagination. And Chinese forces, despite being outmatched technologically, refused to give up. They kept fighting. They kept resisting. And slowly, by 1939, the Japanese advance ground to a halt. They had conquered huge amounts of land, but they couldn't finish the job. They were stuck. And during this conquest, something horrific was happening. Something that still haunts history today. The Japanese military committed unspeakable atrocities against the Chinese civilian population. Why? Because of ideology. Because Japanese propaganda taught their soldiers that Chinese people were racially inferior, that they were less than human. And when you convince soldiers that their enemies aren't really human, when you strip away that fundamental recognition of shared humanity, the results are always catastrophic. The numbers are staggering. Up to 20 million Chinese people would die over the course of World War II. 20 million. Let that sink in for a moment. That's more than the entire population of many countries today. Wiped out, gone. And much of it happened before Europe even entered the war. Speaking of Europe, Germany wasn't sitting idle while Japan carved up China. Hitler was busy building his war machine, testing the limits of what he could get away with. First, he militarized the Rhineland. This was German territory, but it had been demilitarized after World War I. Britain and France protested but did nothing. Then Hitler annexed Austria. Again, protests, but no action. Then came the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia in 1938. This was the moment that produced that worthless peace declaration we talked about earlier. Hitler promised this was his last territorial demand. He swore his ambitions were satisfied. Britain and France believed him. Or at least, they wanted to believe him. But the very next year, in 1939, Hitler showed his true colors. He took the rest of Czechoslovakia, the entire country. And this time, even the most dedicated appeaser couldn't pretend anymore. This was a watershed moment, a turning point. Despite being completely unprepared for war, despite lacking the weapons and training they would need, Britain and France finally drew a line. They gave security guarantees to Poland. They essentially said, if Germany attacks Poland, we will fight. It was a promise that would drag Europe into the abyss. And Germany did attack Poland. In September 1939, German forces crashed across the Polish border, and Europe exploded into all-out war. But here's where the story takes a shocking twist that confused everyone at the time. The Soviet Union, Communist Russia, joined Germany in invading Poland from the east. Think about how insane that was. The Soviets and the Nazis were ideological enemies. Communism and fascism were supposed to be mortal opponents. They hated everything about each other. But in 1939 and 1940, they put aside their hatred and worked together to reshape Europe according to their own designs. The Soviets grabbed the Baltic states. They took pieces of Romania and Finland. Meanwhile, the Germans continued their rampage. They seized Denmark and Norway. And then came one of the most stunning military victories in human history. Using brand new tactics, using coordinated attacks with aircraft, tanks, and infantry working together in ways nobody had seen before, Germany overran France and the Low Countries in just 6 weeks. 6 weeks. France, which had one of the largest and supposedly most powerful armies in the world, collapsed. Britain barely escaped. At a place called Dunkirk, British forces evacuated across the English Channel with help from civilian boats, fishing vessels, pleasure crafts, anything that could float. They got their men out, but they left almost all their heavy equipment behind. Tanks, artillery, supplies, everything abandoned on French beaches. To the world, it looked like Germany was unstoppable, an invincible war machine rolling over everything in its path. And Britain? Britain looked finished, alone and defenseless. But appearances can be deceiving. Britain wasn't quite as alone as it seemed. The empire rallied. Troops from Canada, Australia, India, New Zealand, South Africa, colonies and dominions around the world sent men and supplies. The United States, still technically neutral, started helping too. Plus, governments in exile from occupied countries set up shop in London, continuing the fight from British soil. Germany expected Britain to surrender. Hitler fully anticipated that Britain would see the hopelessness of their situation and negotiate peace. But then Britain got a new prime minister, Winston Churchill, and Churchill had no interest in peace talks. Churchill wanted to fight. His famous words captured the mood perfectly. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender. And Britain had advantages that Germany hadn't fully considered. Meanwhile, across the world, Japan was discovering similar problems. They had occupied French Indochina in 1940, trying to cut off Chinese supply lines and finally end their war in China. But this aggressive move triggered a response that would change everything. The United States, still officially neutral, still not directly involved in the war, decided to make its power felt. American public opinion had been shifting. News of Japanese atrocities in China had filtered back to the United States. People were horrified by the brutality, disgusted by the war crimes, angry at Japanese aggression. And in response to the seizure of French Indochina, America imposed an embargo. Oil and steel, the lifeblood of modern warfare, would no longer flow to Japan. Britain and the Netherlands joined the embargo, and suddenly Japan lost access to 94% of its oil imports. Virtually overnight. Imagine that. You're fighting a massive war in China. Your entire military machine depends on imported oil. And suddenly the tap shuts off. Japan was being strangled economically. They faced a countdown. Their strategic oil reserves would last months, maybe a year if they rationed carefully. After that, everything stops. The Navy sits in port. The Air Force stays grounded. The war machine dies. But America wasn't just cutting off supplies to the Axis. They were simultaneously gearing up their own industrial might and funneling that production exclusively to the Allies. American factories started churning out weapons at an incredible pace, and through something called the Lend-Lease Act, America sent aircraft, ships, vehicles, food, clothing, everything the Allies needed, essentially free of charge. Britain didn't have to pay up front. They could fight now and settle accounts later. This flood of American material posed a strategic nightmare for Germany and Japan. How do you win a war when the world's richest, most industrialized nation is supplying your enemies with unlimited resources? The Axis powers were trapped. Japan was running out of oil and losing their war with China. Germany was becoming dangerously dependent on Soviet goodwill while being strangled by British blockades. They couldn't continue like this. The situation was unsustainable. So in 1941, both Germany and Japan made decisions that would seal their fate. Despite their weakness, despite their resource shortages, despite every logical reason to consolidate and defend what they had, they chose to expand the war. They gambled everything on one desperate throw of the dice. In June 1941, Germany shocked the world by turning on their Soviet ally and launching the largest invasion in military history. Millions of German soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft, crashed across the Soviet border in a massive surprise attack. Hitler believed the Soviet Union was weak, that their military was incompetent, that their society was rotten and would collapse under pressure. Nazi ideology taught that Slavic peoples were racially inferior, less capable, easier to defeat. Hitler himself said they only needed to kick in the front door and the whole rotten structure would come tumbling down. He genuinely believed the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. The Germans had completely misunderstood Soviet resilience, Soviet determination, Soviet willingness to sacrifice everything to defend their homeland. Yes, the initial invasion was successful. German forces advanced hundreds of miles, capturing millions of Soviet soldiers, destroying thousands of tanks and aircraft. But the Soviet Union didn't collapse. Instead, they did something extraordinary. They relocated entire industries. Imagine this. Factories, complete with machinery, workers, and their families, were disassembled and moved thousands of miles east, beyond the Ural Mountains, out of German reach. Production never stopped. Soviet factories kept churning out weapons even as German armies approached Moscow. And Soviet people fought with a ferocity that stunned the Germans. They weren't fighting for Stalin. They were fighting for Mother Russia, for their homes, for their families, for survival. Because German occupation wasn't just conquest. Nazi ideology deemed Slavic peoples subhuman. German plans for occupied Soviet territory included mass starvation, enslavement, and genocide. Soviet citizens understood that surrender meant death, so they fought. They fought in ways that defy comprehension. Soldiers charged German positions knowing they would die. Civilians worked in factories until they collapsed. Entire cities refused to surrender even when surrounded and starving. The human cost was staggering. 25 million Soviet citizens would die in what they called the Great Patriotic War. 25 million. That number is so enormous it's almost impossible to grasp. That's more than the entire population of Australia today. Gone. But their sacrifice denied Germany the quick victory they desperately needed. The German advance slowed. Casualties mounted. Supply lines stretched thin. And in December 1941, just a few miles from Moscow, the German advance stopped. Soviet forces counterattacked. For the first time in the war, the German army was pushed back. The great gamble had failed, and at almost exactly the same moment on the other side of the world, Japan made their own desperate gamble. But they didn't attack the Soviet Union. Instead, they planned something even more audacious. Japanese military planners looked at Southeast Asia and saw exactly what they needed. The Dutch East Indies had oil. British Malaya had rubber and tin. These territories contained all the resources Japan required to continue their war. But capturing these territories would bring the United States into the war. American colonies and protectorates were scattered throughout the Pacific. America had made clear they opposed further Japanese expansion. An attack on British and Dutch colonies would almost certainly trigger American intervention, so Japanese planners devised a strategy. If war with America was inevitable, if the United States would enter the conflict regardless, then Japan needed to strike first. They would launch a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, crippling American naval power and buying time to capture and fortify the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. Then they would defend these conquests so tenaciously Make the cost of reconquest so high that America would negotiate a peace settlement rather than pay the price in blood. The plan rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of American character. Japanese leadership believed Americans were soft, undisciplined, unwilling to make serious sacrifices. They thought America would fight half-heartedly and then quit when casualties mounted. This assessment would prove as catastrophically wrong as Hitler's evaluation of Soviet resilience. December 7, 1941. Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. American battleships burned. Thousands of sailors died. The attack was tactically successful, and in the following weeks Japan swept through Southeast Asia, capturing the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma. They seized the resources they needed. The Southern strategy worked perfectly, but instead of negotiating, instead of accepting Japanese conquests, the United States mobilized for total war. The attack on Pearl Harbor accomplished something Japanese planners never anticipated. It unified American public opinion overnight. Before Pearl Harbor, America was deeply divided. Isolationists argued that European and Asian conflicts weren't America's problem. Interventionists wanted to help the Allies but faced fierce opposition. The attack resolved that debate instantly. The day after Pearl Harbor, Americans lined up at recruiting stations, factories converted to war production. The entire nation geared up for war, and not just any war, total war. Unconditional surrender or nothing. President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill, and Soviet leader Stalin came together and made a pact. They would accept nothing less than complete Axis surrender. No negotiations, no peace settlements, no territorial compromises. The Axis powers would be utterly defeated or the war would continue until they were. And to achieve this, the Allies would wage attritional warfare on a scale never before seen. They would leverage their massive advantages in population, resources, and industrial production to simply overwhelm the Axis through sheer weight of material. This strategy crystallized in machines like the B-24 Liberator bomber. This aircraft wasn't elegant or beautiful. It was functional, utilitarian, designed for mass production, and mass-produced it was. At peak output, American factories built one B-24 every 63 minutes. Think about that rhythm. Every single hour, another heavy bomber rolled off the assembly line, fully equipped, ready for combat, crewed and sent into action. Germany couldn't match this production. Japan couldn't come close. The industrial might of the United States was about to bury the Axis under an avalanche of weapons. By 1942, the tide was shifting. Allied codebreakers had cracked German and Japanese encryption systems, giving Allied commanders crucial intelligence. At the Battle of Midway, American aircraft carriers ambushed Japanese carriers, sinking 4 of them in a single day. The Japanese Navy lost the core of its striking power. They had aircraft carriers left, but losing 4 plus all their experienced pilots in one battle was a blow from which they never recovered. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Germany launched one final desperate offensive trying to capture Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. The advance stalled at a city called Stalingrad. Stalingrad became the symbol of everything this war represented. The bloodiest battle in human history unfolded in the ruins of this city. Soviet forces refused to give up a single street, a single building, a single room. German soldiers found themselves fighting for individual floors of apartment buildings. The combat was so close, so brutal, that grenades were more useful than rifles. Winter arrived, and German forces, stretched thin and undersupplied, found themselves surrounded. An entire German army, hundreds of thousands of men, trapped in the frozen ruins. Hitler ordered them to fight to the death. No retreat, no surrender. And so they did, until there was nothing left. Soviet forces crushed the pocket, capturing what remained of the German Sixth Army. It was a catastrophic defeat, a turning point that shattered the myth of German invincibility. The Axis powers had gambled on quick victories, on enemies collapsing under the shock of their attacks. Instead, they were trapped in exactly the kind of war they couldn't win. A war of attrition. A grinding, brutal struggle where numbers mattered more than tactics. where production capacity trumped battlefield brilliance. And in every conceivable measure, the Allies outnumbered the Axis. More people, more factories, more resources, more of everything. Now the Allies just had to convert those advantages into actual victory on the battlefield. The Battle of the Atlantic doesn't sound like much when you first hear about it. It doesn't have the dramatic clash of massive fleets like ancient naval battles. Instead, it was a struggle that lasted the entire war, a continuous fight conducted across thousands of miles of ocean. Germany deployed submarines, U-boats, in an attempt to starve Britain out of the war. If they could sink enough cargo ships, if they could cut the supply lines between America and Britain, maybe British resistance would crumble. And for a while it worked terrifyingly well. German submarines sank millions of tons of Allied shipping. Merchant sailors died by the thousands. In 1942, during what German submariners gleefully called the Second Happy Time, losses peaked. Convoys were being massacred, but the Allies adapted. They always adapted. That's the pattern that emerges again and again throughout this war. The Axis would develop a tactic or strategy, achieve initial success, and then the Allies would figure out a counter and overwhelm them with superior resources. In the Atlantic, this meant mass-producing cargo ships faster than Germany could sink them. Liberty ships, basic, ugly, but functional cargo vessels, rolled off American assembly lines at an incredible rate. At peak production, 3 Liberty ships were completed every 2 days. Germany would sink 10 ships, and America would build 15. You can't win that math. The Allies also improved their tactics. Better convoy systems with more naval escorts protecting merchant ships, better training for escort crews, better coordination between ships. And then came technology. Very long-range aircraft, modified Liberators, could now patrol the entire Atlantic, covering gaps where U-boats used to operate safely. Sonar equipment improved, making submarines easier to detect. New weapons like the Hedgehog mortar made killing submarines more efficient. One by one, German advantages disappeared. By 1943, the Allies were winning the Battle of the Atlantic decisively, and they turned the same strategy on Japan. Japanese conquests in Southeast Asia gave them access to oil, rubber, iron, everything they needed. But they had to transport these resources back to Japan across thousands of miles of ocean. American submarines lurked in those waters. American aircraft hunted Japanese cargo ships. The resources Japan fought so hard to capture never made it home. Japanese tankers went to the bottom carrying the oil that Japanese aircraft desperately needed. Without fuel, Japanese pilot training time was slashed. New pilots went into combat with minimal experience, making them easy targets for better-trained American aviators. The Axis powers were being strangled, their economies collapsing under blockades they couldn't break. By now, Allied forces had shifted to the offensive everywhere. In the Pacific, American forces island-hopped toward Japan, capturing strategic positions, building airfields, getting closer to the Japanese home islands. In the Soviet Union, the Red Army pushed German forces back, recapturing Ukraine, driving toward Poland. In North Africa, British and American forces knocked Italy out of the war entirely. Mussolini's dreams of a new Roman Empire ended with Italy occupied and split between opposing armies. And with Allied forces now positioned closer to Axis territory, a new weapon could be brought to bear with devastating effect. Air power. The Allied strategic bombing campaign represented industrial warfare taken to its logical, horrifying conclusion. British bombers struck German cities by night, dropping incendiary bombs that created firestorms, burning entire neighborhoods to ash. American bombers came by day, attempting precision strikes on factories, rail yards, oil refineries. The destruction was immense. German cities were systematically demolished. The human cost for Allied bomber crews was staggering. German fighter pilots shot down Allied bombers by the hundreds. There's an artifact from this period, a tail section from a German night fighter whose pilot shot down 121 British bombers. One pilot. 121 heavy bombers, each carrying 10 men. The casualties were enormous on both sides, but the strategic effect was undeniable. German aircraft production had to be dispersed to smaller factories scattered across the country to avoid bombing. This sacrificed efficiency, slowed production, increased costs. German fighters were forced into the air to defend against American bomber formations, and American escort fighters were waiting for them. It was attritional warfare at its most brutal. Trade kills until one side runs out of pilots and planes, and the Allies, with their massive production capacity, could sustain losses that would cripple Germany. American bombers also struck Japan, using incendiary bombs to torch entire Japanese cities. The firebombing campaign killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Entire urban areas ceased to exist. This wasn't precision warfare. This was deliberate targeting of civilian housing to break enemy morale, to destroy the workforce, to terrorize populations into demanding surrender. Modern eyes look at strategic bombing campaigns with horror. The ethical questions are overwhelming. But to Allied commanders facing enemies who showed no sign of surrendering, who fought with fanatical determination, it seemed like a necessary evil. And speaking of evil, 1944 revealed the full horror of the Holocaust. The systematic murder of European Jews had been ongoing since the war began, but as Allied forces advanced, they discovered the camps. They found the gas chambers, the mass graves, the evidence of industrial-scale genocide. 6 million Jewish people murdered, starved, worked to death, gassed, shot. The Nazi vision for Europe included the complete elimination of the Jewish population. The sheer scale of this crime against humanity is almost incomprehensible. 6 million individuals, each with their own life, their own story, their own dreams, systematically exterminated in service of a twisted ideology. That same summer, Allied forces landed in Normandy on D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Allied troops stormed French beaches under withering fire, established a foothold, and began liberating Western Europe. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that destroyed German Army Group Center and drove deep into Poland. Both campaigns succeeded beyond expectations. Allied forces didn't just outnumber the Germans in soldiers and equipment. They had better logistics, better supply systems, better coordination. American and British forces moved in trucks and vehicles. German forces, suffering from chronic fuel shortages, relied primarily on horses. Horses. In a mechanized war, the Germans were using animals for transport because they couldn't fuel enough vehicles. Allied leadership had also learned from their early mistakes. At the beginning of the war, German commanders had significant autonomy to make decisions on the battlefield. This flexibility enabled brilliant tactical successes like the conquest of France. But as the war continued, Hitler increasingly micromanaged military operations. He started believing in his own genius, convinced that his intuition was superior to professional military advice. He refused to allow strategic withdrawals even when positions were clearly untenable, leading to entire armies being surrounded and destroyed. German generals who wanted to pull back, to preserve their forces, were overruled by a dictator who refused to accept reality. Meanwhile, Stalin, who had also micromanaged Soviet forces early in the war with disastrous results, learned to trust his generals. He gave them the authority to plan and execute operations, and Soviet military performance improved dramatically. The contrast was stark. As Allied leadership became more competent, more flexible, more realistic, Axis leadership became increasingly detached from reality. By 1945, the outcome of the war was obvious to everyone except the Axis leadership. Allied forces were advancing on all fronts. German cities were being bombed into rubble. Japan was being blockaded and burned. The war was effectively over, but Germany and Japan refused to surrender. This refusal to accept defeat, this insistence on fighting to the absolute last, would cost millions of additional lives. Japanese kamikaze pilots embodied this suicidal determination. Young men, barely trained, were ordered to crash their aircraft loaded with explosives into Allied ships. It wasn't a tactical choice made in the heat of battle. It was premeditated suicide, officially ordered by commanders who saw their pilots as expendable weapons. This came from a cultural belief that surrender was shameful, that death was preferable to the dishonor of giving up. And so young men climbed into aircraft knowing they would never return, knowing their mission was to die killing as many enemies as possible. German leadership clung to delusions of miracle weapons that would turn the tide. Hitler poured resources into vengeance weapons, the V1 and V2 rockets. These weapons did cause casualties and destruction in England, but they couldn't change the strategic situation. The resources spent developing and producing these weapons would have been far more useful building tanks and fighter aircraft. And the human cost was staggering in another way. Tens of thousands of slave laborers, prisoners worked to death in underground factories, building weapons that accomplished nothing strategically. While Germany chased fantasy superweapons, the Allies developed something that actually changed everything: the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project represented an enormous investment of money, resources, and scientific talent. And it produced a weapon that redefined warfare, that marked a clear dividing line in human history. The nuclear age had arrived. In May 1945, crushed between Soviet forces advancing from the east and American and British forces from the west, Germany finally surrendered. Hitler was dead, having committed suicide in his bunker rather than face capture. The Nazi regime collapsed. Europe was in ruins, millions dead, cities destroyed, entire populations displaced. But Germany was defeated. Japan fought on alone. But their situation was hopeless. American submarines had destroyed their merchant fleet. Their cities were being systematically burned. Their military was shattered. And then came the final blow. 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction was instant and total. Entire cities vaporized in seconds. Tens of thousands killed immediately, many more dying slowly from radiation. And almost simultaneously, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. There was no point in further resistance. The war was over. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. The Second World War ended. The Allies had won. But calling it victory feels inadequate for the scale of what had just occurred. Between 50 and 85 million people died. Entire cities ceased to exist. Countries were carved up and occupied. The world would never be the same. So why did the Allies win? The simple answer is resources. They had more people, more factories, more raw materials, everything needed to wage total war. But resources alone don't guarantee victory. The Allies survived the initial Axis onslaught through sheer determination and refusal to quit. Britain fought on alone when defeat seemed certain. The Soviet Union absorbed casualties that would have destroyed any other nation and kept fighting. China endured occupation and atrocities and continued resisting. These nations demonstrated an indomitable spirit that the Axis never expected. The Allies also learned how to fight. Early in the war, they made mistakes, suffered defeats, lost battles. But they adapted. They developed strategies that leveraged their advantages. They coordinated across nations, sharing resources and intelligence. They innovated technologically. And they mobilized their populations to extraordinary efforts. Millions of ordinary people sacrificed everything. Soldiers who charged into enemy fire. Factory workers who produced weapons around the clock. Civilians who endured rationing, bombing, occupation. The ultimate sacrifice was made by millions who never came home. The Allied nations showed resilience that the Axis couldn't break. On Victory in Europe Day, Churchill addressed crowds in London. His words were simple but profound. "This is your victory." He was right. It wasn't won by generals or politicians alone. It was won by ordinary people who refused to accept tyranny, who fought and worked and sacrificed to create a better world. And that's the story. That's how the Axis lost World War II. Not through a single battle or mistake, but through a series of strategic miscalculations combined with Allied determination that simply could not be broken. Now, if this story moved you, if you learned something new, if you saw World War II in a different light, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because history isn't just about memorizing dates and facts. It's about understanding why things happened, about learning from the past, about recognizing patterns that still matter today. And that's what this channel is all about. telling these stories in ways that make you think, that show you connections you never saw before, that bring history to life. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and join this community. Because there are so many more stories to tell, so many more moments that changed our world, and I want you here for every single one of them. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.